Chapter 3 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betty B. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Through a Tropical Quarantine. One morning when the official sanitary junta, the port doctor, the town druggist, and 3 shopkeepers, all of whom, except the first, were contentedly selling us supplies, were making their inspection within easy hailing distance, the returning Peruvian diplomat dealt himself a hand in the game. In a few pointed remarks, he demanded that they send a doctor on board to make an examination. The port captain returned an indignant oration, in which, after paying tribute to the ancestral deeds of the diplomat's forebears, he hurled shame at the diplomat for his selfish lack of patriotism in so distrusting the conclusions and acts of his countrymen. Obviously he had been so enervated by effete foreign associations well, it sounded like good oratory anyway. There was no doubt in their minds that we were concealing yellow fever. Slowly the 5 days of quarantine passed with this solemn official mockery. The Chinamen ceased from troubling and yielded the daily shilling. The chicken coop was returned to the authority of the steward, although once, for variety, a Chinaman shared it with a couple of turkeys for some hours. And then the final day arrived. Leisurely the official boat rowed out. The passengers for Ecuador, it announced, were to be transferred to the leprous-looking brigantine, where they would remain in quarantine until they could be transferred to a northbound steamer. Incidentally, they were privileged to pay 12 sols a day each for board. Then the official boat was rowed back, and that was all. Indignantly, the passengers met and decided to pay no more daily quarantine charges. It seemed as if the company needed a little stimulating, perhaps. The purser chuckled sympathetically, and then a self-appointed committee looked over the chicken coop with a speculative eye. It was heartening, for at least the monotony would be broken. That night an official boat stole out of the darkness alongside, confirmed the rumor that the port captain was holding us for a week longer to suit his convenience, then the messenger disappeared in the night. This was interesting as pure news matter, and that was all. Came the morning of the 6th day without change. And then the diplomat's cables to Lima had effect. A doctor had been appointed on a cabled order from Lima to make a real examination. He came out accompanied by a sanitary junta of very sour officials, climbed on board, and began his work. They pulled away and returned in the afternoon. The young ship's surgeon and the new doctor shouted the report across the water. Barring the 3 cases of malarial fever between decks, we had a clean bill of health. The official boat drew a trifle nearer. In the stern sheets the port doctor scanned a formidable-looking medical volume that lay open on his knees, and the druggist bent his head over the same pages. Solemnly they accepted little test tubes that the ship's surgeon passed across to them, and examined them gravely. They turned a few pages of the book and asked a question. The new doctor answered it promptly. Again they shuffled the pages and came back with another answer, and then more hasty pouring. At length came their decision. It was true that the excellent doctors had described no such symptoms as were standardized for either yellow fever or the pest bubonica, but there was nothing to prevent those doctors from stating and confirming that which was not true. Therefore, be it resolved that we had yellow fever, but were concealing it. They were the incorruptible guardians of a nation's health. What the diplomat said was direct and voluble and carried perfectly across the calm evening sea. Heaven was a sad witness of his unpatriotic perfidy, for he threatened them with a touch of patriotism direct from Lima upon the hour of his arrival, however distant or uncertain that might be. A little conference, and they voted on our admission, 2 and 2. Could anything be fairer? Their honest hearts thanked Heaven for the thought of this simple and adroit deadlock that preserved their official activities and at the same time kept us in a profitable quarantine. Tersely, it was pointed out by the diplomat that by virtue of the cabled commission, the new doctor was a member of the board. Vote again. That evening we wandered through the dust and sand of Paita and rode grandly and briefly to the outskirts of the town in the single mule and rope tram that skirted the beach. It is well in the troubled times of quarantine on the West Coast always to travel with an accredited diplomat on board. All next day the whir and clatter of the steam winches and the bang of cargo kept up, and again we visited the dusty port, wading through the lines of Panama hat sellers that lined up to greet the landing of our small boat. Of hotel runners there were none, this being due to the fact that there was but one hotel to which the stray custom is bound to drift. At the hotel we saw a few palms and tropical blooms in tubs and in a carefully irrigated patio, for Paita is, like all that West Coast, rainless. As a cold matter of meteorological fact, it does rain sometimes. I accidentally started an acrimonious discussion by a merely polite remark on the weather, as to whether it had been 9, 11, or 14 years since the last rain. In apparent proof of this, there is a wide, dusty canal bulkheaded with piling on either side, which in these intervals between showers serves as a native market. Little red flags flutter from the chicherias where the opaque, yellow Indian corn beer is sold, ranging in flavor and potency from warm buttermilk to the wicked stone fence of New Jersey. Back of the town, a trail wades through the sand to the crest of the long bluffs. The feet of countless pack trains have worn a driveway through the ridge until, stepping through, there are suddenly spread before the view the endless stretches of a dried and dusty desert that has been an ocean's prehistoric bed. The hot airs quiver and boil from the twisting valleys or ridges of blistering sand and rock, and through the pulsing heat the occasional pack train in the distance turns to a wavering, shimmering thread. To the imagination a desert rises as a dull, gray expanse, endless in its colorless monotony. Here there was a riot of color, every hue raw and gorgeous, except green, from the soft purples and cool sapphire of the shadows to the blazing yellows and reds and white of the open spaces. And in the garish stretch of a dead ocean there slowly rises, like a parching thirst, a longing for a sweep of tender green. The little governmental touch from Lima had cleared the path of quarantine, and we began a dot and carry one course down the coast from Paita. Every day our winches whirred and clattered off some dusty, sand-blown port. Before our anchor had touched bottom in the open roadstead, a fleet of lanchas, heavy, double-ended, open lighters of from 10 to 25 tons capacity, were crawling over the water. The dozen long oars that were their means of locomotion, and that were manipulated on an independent, competitive basis, spraddled on each side, gave the fleet a close resemblance to an army of drunken bugs struggling forward on uncertain legs. There was always a race to the Mapocho's side, and the first to get there caught the heaving line. Once a lancha defeated in a close finish came on and cut the heaving line, so that its rival was left with a useless section while it hurriedly hauled in on the hawser. Instantly a fine naval engagement was in progress as the lanchas locked like a couple of old Carthaginian galleys. By the aid of force peace was established and the rightful and original award of the hawser sustained. Had it not been, as the first officer explained, they would need a new heaving line at every port. The bluffs of the coast gave way to hills, and these in turn to higher ones. The Andes were closing in on the Pacific. At times the great mountain chain towered from the very water's edge in a succession of steep cliffs, each receding tier softening in the distance and rising through the slowly shifting strata of clouds until only the gashes of white snow picked out the towering peaks. Here and there steep, rocky islets fringed the coastline, and we stood far out to save the chances, and yet there was no appreciable change in the proportions of the tremendous mountain range. The sense of proportion and distance was lost in the comparison of these vast reaches. A rocky islet, a steep sugar loaf affair, rose from the ocean perhaps 5 feet, not much as an island or a mountain peak. Through the binoculars a tiny unknown speck at the base developed into a full rigged bark with tapering masts above which the Sugar Loaf Rock rose for thousands of feet in the clear air, and on it was a wretched colony of guano workers. Then the coast opened out into level reaches again, with occasional lines of irrigation ditches showing a thread of green. Occasionally, twice I think, there was actually a landlocked harbor. It was one of these, Chimbote, that James G. Blaine proposed to use or secure as a naval base and coaling station. It is perfectly sheltered with a narrow, bottleneck entrance guarded by a rocky island in the middle, which is covered with a wriggling film of seals that are perfectly indifferent to the close passage of ships or men. In this harbor rode the queerest of sea-going craft. In Mexico I had once seen a Chinaman fit himself up a home from about 8 feet of one end of a hopelessly wrecked dugout, take in a partner, and then the two of them paddle off up the river in the fishing business, sleeping and eating aboard the flat iron-shaped thing. Here in this case was a bow and stern bolted together without a midship section, and both the bow and stern were those of a fairly full-sized tramp freighter. The bow was the ram bow of a warship, and back of it there was barely room to squeeze in a capstan and a tiny hatch. The foremast shared the bridge, a funnel and whistle jammed themselves up against the bridge, while the short distance to the stern rail gave room for a squat cabin out of which rose the mainmast. A score of Chimbote launches were as bigger, and where this telescoped liner would find room for cargo or coal after providing for engines and a galley is a mystery. Yet it does carry cargo and ambles along from port to port, a tragic marvel of compression. The day before, off Huanchazo, where a storm far out had piled up a heavy, oily groundswell that even put the racks on the tables, a wealthy old Peruvian lady had been hoisted abroad in a cask clinging to her son. She was a garrulous old soul, powdered like a marshmallow, with 3 chins and a little mustache, and her son was the very apple of her eye. Therefore, son was what one might expect. His adolescent and mature ambition was to be the amorous cut-up of the coast, and so far he had succeeded generously in making a smug, self-satisfied nuisance of himself. He counted doting mother's allowance publicly, drank warm champagne noisily when thrifty mother was not around, and dressed in the Huanchazo idea of French fashions for men. In the morning he did not appear. Mother explained fondly, but not the truth. She did not know it. Passengers are warned not to go between decks after dark. The steerage hutches and the crew have the freedom of that deck. Son prowled down on some shifty little romantic project of his own. In the darkness he suddenly felt 2 sharp little pricks in the skin of his back, and 1 sharp little prod in front. They felt very, very much like the points of knives. Up went son's hands promptly, and in the blackness he felt heavy hands pulling out his maternal allowance, the beautiful money with which he was to flaunt his fascinations in Lima. Hence, no Limanian gay life. Mother, it seemed, was a thrifty Spartan in money matters, and son was in his berth, weeping. A steward told us the latter, confidentially, of course. Samacho, Chimbote, Salaverry, Supe, and then at last, in the daybreak of the morning after the last named, and in the midst of a soft, clouded day, Callao. There was the usual customs search of the baggage, a maddening process to an Englishman, mildly irritating to a Frenchman, and accepted meekly and placidly by Americans as a matter of course from a thorough training in our own home ports. I have never passed through any country that could give as close an imitation of our own thorough methods of dock robbery and tariff brigandage as Peru. A quarter of an hour by train through a rich soil that can be worked only by irrigation, and Lima, the first halt on the continent, has been attained. For 2 weeks there was nothing to do but to idle in Lima, a delightful city full of the old contrasts of highly civilized sybaritic pleasures alongside of the squalid, aimless poverty of the survivors of a devastated empire. There is the Bois, where fashionable equipages with cockaded, copper-colored lackeys, possibly in bare or sandaled feet, on the box, silver-mounted harness and heavy. Chilean-bred coach horses jingle past in procession on Sunday afternoons, while some gallant Peruano lopes aside with huge silver stirrups and a saddle almost solid with bullion. The sodden side streets where the buzzard and the scavenger pig are man's best friend, the cathedral where lies the desiccated body of Pizarro in a marble casket like an aquarium, the one open side covered with glass through which may be seen the remains of that treacherous old buccaneer, with his head refastened by a silver wire to guard against a repetition of the theft. The cathedral itself, with its murky interior smoked by the votive candles of millions of conscript converts, its queer carvings where the ecclesiastical memories of architecture have been freely rendered by the Indian stonecutters, the clubs, the cafes, and the ambrosial coffee, chapels with the bullion-covered walls, the wretched tobacco at high tariff, extorted prices, all these, and then the Hotel Mori. Peace be to Savarin, to Delmonico, and to Chamberlain. They did well in their way, but they never served a squid or cuttlefish floating like a small hot water bottle, tender and delicious in an inky sauce of their own founding, nor a starfish sprawled in a five-pointed dream of savory, lobster-like succulence, nor senoritas, a delicate species of scallop, each with its tiny scarlet tongue draped across the pearl-white bivalve bosom, and that, steamed or not, melted in one supreme ecstatic flavor, nor 5-inch langoustin, fresh from the cold waters of the Andean hills, nor compounded or invented a strawberry gin cocktail of surpassing allurement, cooled by a piece of ice kept in a flannel-lined drawer and returned thereto after stirring. None of these things had they, and so by just that much they fell short. In the Hotel Mori there was a written bill of fare for those who could merely read, but for the expert, the fastidious, or the adventurous, there was a redoubt in the main room whose flanking bastions and crest were a solid array of great joints and little joints, steaks, chops, unnamed fish in platoons, and senoritas in brigades, fruits, vegetables, and all of the foregoing, and more, laid out in tiers and terraces, whose foundations were of cool, inviting seaweeds and mosses, and still further seductively embellished with a variety of paper ribbons and crests and cockades, until one almost lost sight of the pagodas of gaudy, many-storied cakes and confections that rose like watchtowers at judicious intervals along the battlements. It was a salon. To the shuffling, woolen-capped, sandaled, or barefooted Indian at one's heels the directions were given. You chose what you would as they thus reposed in the altogether, and then repaired to await in a sawdust-floored cavern at one side, and in a state of serene and expectant bliss, the certain pleasures of the very immediate future. You waited, it is true, at a warped table with a stained cloth, on which a bent cruet supplied the only note of elegance. And, lest any of the precious viands be lost in transit or breakage, you knew that you would be served with a substantial hard-shell crockery, only slightly more vulnerable than reinforced concrete. Presently your Indian reappeared in a shuffling trot, scattering sawdust from the prow of each sandal like a harbor pile driver under full speed. The hard-shell crockery is white hot, but he has the hands of a salamander. and then with a flourish he drops an assorted collection of tableware somewhere within reach. You are served. And what a repast! Peace be to Savarin, Delmonico, and enough. Comparisons are invidious, and the Morey can stand alone in the continent of his choosing. Very shortly the sailing day came, for, since it was not possible to land in Mollendo, owing to that port being afflicted with a quarantine, it had been necessary to catch a steamer that would put us through the surf at Quilca, a hole in a cliff that has its only function in these times of quarantine. A farewell inspection of the redoubt and bastions, a recharging of the bottle of salicylic acid and alcohol, which while it had in no way abated the fleas of the Hotel Morey, yet had mitigated their consequences, and Lima and Callao drifted into the background with the closing day. From Quilca in some way we would connect by muleback and pack train across the desert to the desert station of La Jolla, with the railroad to Arequipa, and hence to Lake Titicaca and across to La Paz. Chapter 4